Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if there is a clear path to becoming a brain expert, a clinical neuropsychologist, something that helps people with brain injuries or conditions, and if Canada has its act together on training these specialists? Well, this new paper really dives deep into that question. This paper isn't about a specific experiment with patients, but more of a big picture look at how we train people to be clinical neuropsychologists in Canada and how that compares to the rest of the world. Think of it as a policy review or a call to action for the field. The central question is essentially, is Canada doing a good job training its brain experts? And how can we make it better? The researchers noticed that while clinical neuropsychology is super important, Canada doesn't have one single clear way to train these specialists. This is becoming a bigger deal now, that different parts of Canada are changing how they regulate psychologists. They looked at training programs in other countries and what clinical neuropsychologists do in Canada. They found that relying on master's degrees for this specialized work has its own set of problems, like not having enough clear rules or enough qualified people to train new students. So, the big idea here is that Canada needs one unified training path for clinical neuropsychology to make sure future experts are well trained and to make it easier for them to practice anywhere in the country and even internationally. So why is this even important? Well, clinical neuropsychologists are like detectives for the brain. They help figure out what is going on with people who have issues with their brain function. Due to things like strokes, dementia, or developmental challenges, they assess, diagnose, and even help with rehabilitation. This field has grown a lot because we understand more and more about how our brains work and how problems in the brain affect our behavior. In fact, brain and nervous system disorders are the leading cause of disability worldwide. While many countries are developing clinical neuropsychology, Canada has been a leader in this area, with a high number of these specialists per person compared to many other places. So, if Canada is good at this, why do they need a unified approach? Well, that is where the story gets interesting. Canada has a really impressive history in neuropsychology. Some of the foundational research in understanding memory by Dr. Brenda Milner, or how our frontal lobes control our thinking skills by Dr. Donald Stuss, came from Canadians. Dr. Tom Tombo also developed a key tool used worldwide to check if people are really trying their best during assessments. Despite this strong history, the paper points out a major issue: there is no single, consistent way to become a licensed clinical neuropsychologist in Canada. This lack of uniformity starts right at the academic training level. While there are a few programs specifically accredited for clinical neuropsychology, many psychologists who specialize in this area actually come from more general clinical psychology doctoral programs that have a neuropsychology stream or focus. These streams can vary a lot in what they require in terms of courses and experience. Canada's approach is a bit different from, say, the United States, where specialization often happens more strongly at the postdoctoral level. In Canada, it often starts earlier, sometimes even alongside foundational clinical psychology training. Some countries even have specialized training after a person already has a degree, but in Canada, it is usually built into the degree program itself. Also, unlike doctors, psychologists in Canada don't typically have their training positions funded by the government, which limits how many training spots universities can create. This inconsistency becomes even more significant when you look at how clinical neuropsychologists are regulated. In most Canadian provinces, being a clinical neuropsychologist is largely declared by the practitioner themselves. However, some provinces like Ontario and Saskatchewan do review a psychologist's training and experience. Quebec is a bit different, requiring a specific certification to practice neuropsychology. The big problem is that national laws like the Canadian Free Trade Agreement mean that if you are licensed in one province, you should be able to practice in another with the same title. But with different training standards across provinces, this can get complicated and might even lead to provinces lowering their standards to match others. This means you could have master's level psychologists or doctoral level psychologists practicing as clinical neuropsychologists with varying levels of specialized training and no clear national benchmark. The paper also touches on how clinical neuropsychologists fit into the Canadian healthcare system. Unlike doctors, psychologists can't directly bill provincial healthcare. They rely on hospital budgets, private insurance, or out-of-pocket payments. This often puts them in competition with other, less expensive health providers, and sometimes other healthcare professionals don't fully understand what a neuropsychologist does or their level of expertise. Over the years, the structure of psychology departments in hospitals has also changed, with psychologists often reporting to non-psychologists, which can make it hard to maintain professional identity and get proper oversight. And to top it all off, Canada is facing a shortage of psychologists overall, and this is expected to get worse. While Canada has a good number of neuropsychologists compared to some countries, there is a lot of variation across provinces. So, to fix this, the researchers looked at what other countries are doing. They found a whole range of training models. Some countries, like Mexico, might allow practice after a bachelor's degree plus significant supervised clinical experience. Many countries, like France, India, Spain, and South Africa, consider a master's degree to be the standard for becoming a clinical neuropsychologist, with options for further specialization. Italy has a system that requires a psychology degree followed by years of specialized postgraduate training. Finland and Germany have master's degrees followed by extensive master's training and supervised practice, which starts to look more like a doctorate in terms of time commitment. In the UK, Australia, Ireland, and the United States, a doctoral degree is generally the entry point, often followed by specific postdoctoral training in neuropsychology. What is common across these different models is a growing trend towards defining clear competencies. Basically, the specific skills and knowledge someone needs to be good at clinical neuropsychology. Many countries are actively discussing what these competencies should be and how to incorporate them into training programs. The key takeaway is that most international standards acknowledge that clinical neuropsychology is a specialized field that requires more training than a general psychology degree. Now, let's bring this back to Canada. The paper argues strongly against a master's level education being sufficient for independent practice. They point out that major North American psychology organizations agree that a doctorate is the entry-level standard for psychology in general, let alone a specialization. They also compare Canada to English-speaking countries like the US, UK, and Australia, where doctorate-level training is the norm for this field, even when master's programs exist elsewhere. They often involve years of supervised practice that go far beyond what is currently offered in Canada's master's programs. Essentially, a master's degree alone, without extensive additional supervised training, doesn't seem to meet international standards for safe and effective clinical neuropsychology practice. The paper acknowledges that Canada's current doctoral programs, especially those accredited by the Canadian Psychological Association, have produced many competent clinical neuropsychologists. The existence of more site programs in Quebec, which focus more on practice, alongside PhD programs, seems to be helping meet the demand for services there. Currently, most Canadian clinical neuropsychologists are doctorally trained and complete a pre-doctoral residency. Some may choose to pursue board certification, like through the American Board of Professional Neuropsychology, ABPN, which requires additional exams and a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. However, opportunities for these specialized postdoctoral fellowships are limited in Canada and the cost of certification is high. This results in fewer Canadian neuropsychologists pursuing this advanced certification compared to their US counterparts. The paper also highlights significant equity concerns. Access to graduate training in psychology, including clinical neuropsychology, is limited by the scarcity of training spots and the high financial cost. Many graduate trainees face financial struggles, and historically underrepresented groups often experience greater challenges. Even once employed, pay can vary significantly between public and private sectors, further highlighting equity gaps. The authors also discuss how the emphasis on PhD programs, which often have stronger research components and better access to funding, might inadvertently create barriers for certain groups compared to side programs, although side programs can have higher tuition. Overall, the paper suggests that clinical neuropsychology training programs are not equally accessible to all members of society, especially marginalized and minority individuals. Given all these issues, the paper makes a strong case for a unified national training standard for clinical neuropsychology in Canada. Recent changes in regulatory bodies like Ontario's plan to remove clinical neuropsychology as a distinct practice area underscore the urgent need for a national standard. This will help ensure consistent training requirements and facilitate the movement of practitioners across the country, especially as national laws encourage this mobility. Aligning with US training models through bodies like the ABP has some precedent, but the authors suggest that a Canadian-specific board equivalent, geared towards global competency standards and perhaps less focused on mandatory postdoctoral training, which is scarce in Canada, might be more practical, with the potential shift towards master's level entry for general psychology practice. In some provinces, establishing clear and distinct national training requirements for clinical neuropsychology becomes even more critical if master's level practice is to be considered for clinical neuropsychology. It would require a massive overhaul of academic and post-academic training, including accreditation for master's programs and structured, supervised practical experience, which currently doesn't exist in Canada. The authors propose creating a national clinical neuropsychology competency standard. This standard should detail the necessary skills and knowledge, be separate from provincial regulatory bodies, and cover all aspects of training from academic coursework to clinical experiences. This standard should include specialized coursework in assessment and treatment, training in evaluating research for clinical practice, and extensive supervised practical experience across diverse populations and settings. Importantly, these competencies align well with existing accreditation standards for doctoral clinical psychology programs in Canada. They believe this standard should be competency-based and flexible enough to accommodate different training pathways, like those focusing more on research, PhD, versus those focusing more on practice, SID, potentially leading to a higher ratio of practitioners per population, as seen in Quebec. The paper concludes by emphasizing Canada's rich history in neuropsychology and the immense value of these specialists. While the authors acknowledge their own potential biases as doctorally trained neuropsychologists, they highlight their diverse backgrounds to show a broad perspective. They believe now is an opportune time for Canada to develop this national training standard, drawing lessons from global practices while crafting a uniquely Canadian solution. So, what does this all mean for us? It means that while Canada has produced some amazing neuropsychologists, the path to becoming one isn't as clear or as consistent as it could be. Establishing a national training standard would help ensure that all future clinical neuropsychologists have the necessary skills and knowledge to provide excellent care across the country, protect the public, and maintain the high standards that Canadians have set in this field. It's about building a more standardized, equitable, and effective future for brain health expertise in Canada. And that is the story of this paper. What are your thoughts on the need for a unified training standard like this? Let us know in the comments below if you found this breakdown helpful. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into fascinating research. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.